Hi everyone, my name is Professor Leanne Hydes and I'm here to welcome you to the APSAD Early Mid-Career Researcher webinar, both as the convener of this webinar series and as the President-elect of APSAD. First of all, APSAD would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and the community. We pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Before we get started, I'd just really like to thank and acknowledge all of the early career researchers who submitted an abstract for this webinar. We had so many great submissions that we couldn't possibly fit all of the presentations into one webinar. So after this, please visit the APSAD website to view our showcase of new and exciting research from Australasia's top early career researchers. Finally, I'd really like to thank the EMCR subcommittee of APSAD for putting together the webinar and the invited speakers who are participating in the panel discussion at the end of this webinar. So that's all for me. So I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Ben Reardon from the Centre of Alcohol Policy Research, who's going to chair the first session of rapid presentations. Enjoy.
Right, thanks Leanne. I also just wish to note before kicking on that I'm hosting this webinar on Wurundjeri land, and so I just wish to pay my respect as well to elders past, present and emerging. So thank you very much for joining us. This is super exciting that we get to do this webinar. We were overly excited and have actually jam-packed so much information into the next 2 hours. So we're going to be moving at a pretty frantic pace. So just to let you know what's going on for the next 2 hours, this is kind of what our schedule looks like. So I think you can all see my screen. We're going to start for the first half or the first hour of the session highlighting some of the research that's going on from ECRs in Australasia. So we've got 8 rapid fire presentations followed by a quick Q&A. We're then going to hand it over to Robin Room, who is going to present Drug and Alcohol Review's paper award, which is very cool. Hopefully then, if all things go well, we'll have a 2-minute break so you can go get a coffee. And I'll hand over the hosting duties to Cassandra Wright. And we've got a few invited speakers to talk a little bit about their career trajectories and offer some sort of tips and tricks about how they got to where we are. So as Leanne mentioned, we were oversubscribed for this webinar and we just could not put everything we wanted in. So because of that, there are some great posters and additional talks that we are hosting on our webpage. So I'd highly recommend after this, please go there and check out some awesome work by other ECRs in Australasia. Finally, before we start, I have to do a shameless plug for APSAD's EMCR committee. For those who don't know, we, along with Deb and Liz, worked really hard to bring you this webinar, but we also do a lot of other very, very cool stuff. So we're a group of these guys that you can see on your screen. We're researchers throughout Australasia, and we aim to provide resources and support for early career researchers. Now, most of what we do is sort of around our flagship event at APSAD. It's this big networking event, but we also do a lot of other things that maybe people are not as aware of. So firstly, we're very active on our social medias. Join us on LinkedIn, join us on Facebook, and make sure you're following us on Twitter. I should point out that the Facebook group is excellent. That's actually where I saw advertised my last 2 jobs. So there are job advertisements up there, as well as some good interaction between ECRs. So please do make sure that you use that resource and you jump on there. Also, we have a little corner of APSAD's website dedicated to EMCRs. So after this as well, you can feel free to go and check that out. We have some podcasts, some publishing tips and information, as well as some funding resources and a mixture of other things. And then finally, just to sort of plug, one thing we really worked hard for was to make sure that students could be free members for APSAD. So please, if you are a student and you're watching this, make sure you become a member with us because it is exceptionally free. Cool. All right, that's all of my frantic talking done. I do want to now get this first session started. So how it's going to work is we have 8 videos, which are 3 minutes long, from 8 researchers right throughout Australasia. And we've broken these down into 2 rounds. So we're going to have 4 presenters and then a brief Q&A session. And then we're going to start a second session of, again, 4 presenters, and then have another brief Q&A session. Keep in mind as well, as you're going through, that you'll be asked to vote on a People's Choice Award. So keep note of who your favorite is, because we will put up a poll at the end and ask you to vote. As I mentioned, we have time for questions. And rather than sort of people blowing up on their mics, because there are about 40 of you at the moment, we ask that you put your questions in the question box, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your Zoom computer thing at the moment. So the Q&A box down the bottom, please make sure you're writing questions in there. The other thing is, because we have 8 speakers, do direct your questions to a particular speaker. So otherwise we won't know who that question's going to. And once we have a Q&A session open, I'll read out some of the questions and ask each of the presenters to talk and provide some answers. So that is as much information as I can pack into a very short period of time. I now want to hand it over to Deb, who is going to share these videos. So our first 4 videos come from Alana Fisher, Andre Mason, Caitlin Douglas, and Gabe Culuzzi. So Deb, I'll hand it over to you now.
Just give us a second while we work out the sound.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Alana Fisher, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Matilda Centre. And today I'll be presenting findings from a needs assessment on the informational and decision support needs of people with at-risk alcohol use and depression. So the aims of this study were to
Kia ora. My name's Andre Mason, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Otago in New Zealand.
Thanks for everyone's understanding. We'll just try that again.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Alana Fisher, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Matilda Centre. And today I'll be presenting findings from a needs assessment on the informational and decision support needs of people with at-risk alcohol use and depression. So the aims of this study were to assess key stakeholder perspectives on the informational and decision support needs of people with at-risk alcohol use and depression when first deciding on treatment. So the methods that we used for this study was an online survey, and that was delivered to 3 main stakeholder groups. And in the end, we managed to recruit 56 people with at-risk alcohol use and depression, 65 clinicians from different professional backgrounds, and 16 family members. The survey did identify some key unmet patient decision support needs. For example, when patients are first deciding on their treatment, some difficult decisions which they encounter include whether to focus on depression, alcohol use, or both together, whether or not to start psychological therapy, whether to add on medication for their depression symptoms, and whether to reduce or rather to abstain from drinking. All 3 stakeholder groups also identified elevated levels of decisional conflict amongst patients. And this meant that patients were feeling uninformed, uncertain about the options available, unsupported in the decision-making process, unable to make a choice about their treatment, and therefore more likely to delay making a choice. We also asked patients to indicate their preferences for involvement in decision-making, and as you can see here, the vast majority of patients would prefer to either take a patient-led or a shared approach to decision-making. However, when we asked patients to indicate how involved they had been in making decisions about their treatment, you can see that around a third were indicating that they hadn't been as involved as they would have liked to have been. So in some key take-home messages include the fact that people do have unmet information and decision support needs when they are deciding on treatment for at-risk alcohol use and depression. And the findings from this need assessment will be used to guide the development of targeted decision support tools for these patients. And a final note that early stakeholder engagement in a process such as this is likely to strengthen the acceptability, feasibility, and usefulness of future tools. Thank you for your time.
Kia ora. My name's Andre Mason, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Today, what I'm wanting to talk to you about is the possible links between substance use and suicidality in Australian men. Suicide is a growing health concern in Australia and indeed around the world. It is the leading cause of death for Australians between 15 and 44 years old, and on average, 8 Australians die by suicide every day. 6 of these are typically male. In 2018 alone, 3,046 Australians took their own life and over 65,000 attempted suicide. So, given the growing health concern that suicide presents to Australians, and in particular Australian men, we sought to understand whether different substance use behaviours are related to suicidality. To address this research question, we used the second wave of the 10 to Men study, the Australian Longitudinal Study on Male Health, which is a national study of the health and lifestyles of Australian men at different stages of life. This data was collected across 2015 and 2016. 7,464 adult Australian men aged 18 to 60 completed the measures of interest for this research question. These included items related to depressive symptoms, alcohol consumption, and well-being, as well as single item questions related to drug use in the past 12 months, lifetime suicidal ideation, and lifetime suicide attempts. The 4 drugs you see there on the screen have been included in the analyses. Marijuana has been left as an individual variable, while cocaine, amphetamines, and ecstasy have been combined into a other illicit drugs variable. After controlling for age, we see that marijuana use and other illicit drug use in the last 12 months, as well as depressive symptoms, predict lifetime suicidal thoughts. Alcohol consumption, on the other hand, was not related. When looking at suicide attempts, we see that lifetime suicidal thoughts, alcohol consumption, marijuana use in the past 12 months, and depressive symptoms predict greater likelihood of an individual having made a suicide attempt over and above their lifetime suicidal thoughts and age. And illicit drug use in the past 12 months was unrelated, however. Further, we see that alcohol consumption directly mediated the relationship between lifetime suicidal thoughts and a later suicide attempt. The effect of this relationship was small over and above the direct relationship of suicidal thoughts on a later suicide attempt, however. In conclusion, when we look at alcohol, greater consumption was associated with a greater likelihood of a suicide attempt, but not suicidal thoughts. Alcohol consumption further mediated the relationship between lifetime suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts. Looking at marijuana, greater consumption in the past 12 months predicted a greater likelihood of both lifetime suicide attempts and thoughts. Other illicit drugs, greater consumption in the past 12 months predicted a greater likelihood of lifetime suicidal thoughts, but not suicide attempts. Cheers.
Hi everyone, I'm Caitlin. I'm from the Burnett Institute and my presentation explores stigma towards alcohol and other drugs among young migrants. These are our disclosures. So Goffman defines stigma as a social process in which a person or group's attribute is identified as different, less desirable, or dangerous. We know that stigma is a major barrier that prevents access to alcohol and other drug-related support, particularly among migrant communities. I conducted 16 interviews and 1 focus group to understand alcohol and other drug-related beliefs and experiences among young migrants. Participants were from the city of Wyndham, which is an area that's southwest of Melbourne and home to a high proportion of people from newly arrived communities. The participants were from a range of ethnicities and religious backgrounds. However, there were common experiences that related to stigma. Many of the participants perceived that alcohol consumption and cannabis use were a normal part of Australian youth culture. However, most were from backgrounds where these behaviours were negatively labelled as being lazy, having a bad upbringing, and being out of control. This meant that within their communities, there was generally a preference for abstinence, which was not practical based on the young people's experiences. Participants described the expectations that were placed upon them by families and society to be successful. These expectations meant that any alcohol and drug use was seen as deviant. They felt like their parents had limited knowledge about other drugs, so tended to overreact if they found out. While many of the participants consumed alcohol and recreational drugs socially with their peer groups to belong, they believed that their families would assume that any use was problematic. Disclosing these behaviours meant there was risk of gossip, exclusion, and secondary stigma towards families. Participants believed that consequences were worse for females who were expected to drink with more shame than males. Participants described hiding their alcohol and drug use from families and were unlikely to disclose behaviours to professional services. So overall, we know there's a need for interventions that reduce stigma towards alcohol and other drugs so that people from migrant backgrounds can access support when needed. And we also need to work with young migrants to ensure that responses are relevant to their experiences. So thank you very much, particularly to the participants, and please follow up with any questions you have. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gabriel Culuzzi, and I'm going to be presenting some key findings from a qualitative project on declining adolescent drinking. So we've seen a decline in adolescent drinking for nearly 20 years, but there's still a lack of qualitative research in this area. So this project aimed to explore these declines through qualitative interviews with young light and non-drinkers from Melbourne. So I've separated out key findings into 5 overarching themes. So the first was parenting. So in our sample, we found that young people talked about their parents taking a general harm minimization approach. They encouraged open communication and attempts to delay or reduce their children's drinking. They also encouraged young people to be responsible and conscious of the risks of alcohol, whilst focusing on their education. There was also a high level of physical and virtual monitoring, particularly with the common use of smartphones. This leads to the second theme of technology, which allowed young people to be constantly connected to their social networks. This created new opportunities to socialize with technology directly, such as through gaming and streaming where alcohol wasn't present, but it also allowed them to organize social events where alcohol was present and was sometimes central. It also heightened risks around self-presentation and encouraged certain ways of being healthy. Although technology took up large amounts of leisure time, leisure and free time was also spent being productive by focusing on education, sport, and extracurriculars. It was also important for young people to use leisure to escape these pressures by relaxing, or alternatively, by socializing with friends at parties or gatherings. So there were clearly some different meanings in how leisure was used. These tensions were implicated in how young people understood health and placed particular importance on social and mental well-being. Health also framed alcohol as having a range of acute and long-term health problems linked to physical safety, chronic health problems, addiction, and neurovulnerability. These discourses were reinforced through several sources, including parents, education, and the media. This both culminated in and was a result of a clear future orientation, where education and image were central. Here, success was viewed as being happy, healthy, and secure in life. This tended to delay rather than preclude drinking in our sample, where alcohol was something participants thought they could see themselves engaging in with varying degrees into the future. So, to summarize, I want to highlight the clear interconnection of all these themes. They all work together to encourage abstinence and discourage heavy drinking. Although policy levers may have played a part, most of these changes seem to be a result of broader social and economic drivers. And I'll qualify this by saying alcohol use still seemed to be a common part of the way many young people socialized, but it was a less prominent feature of the lives of our participants for all these reasons. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thanks team. We aren't seeing much love in the Q&A section, but we have a few questions that have just been sent through the comments. So Alana, you're up first. Were there any similarities or differences which emerged across different stakeholder groups? And you're on mute. Sorry.
Thanks for the question. So we did, unfortunately, because of the small family member sample, we weren't able to include the family member sample in statistical comparisons of the stakeholder groups. However, we did run some between the patient and clinician groups. Some differences that did emerge between those groups was that fewer patients, or rather a larger proportion of patients perceived that they weren't as involved in the decision-making process as they would have liked, whereas clinicians were tending to state that patients were as involved as they would have liked to be in that process. So there seems to be a breakdown in communication with regards to preferences for involvement, and possibly also what aspects of the decision-making process that patients do consider to be involvement, and which aspects of the decision-making process perhaps aren't as valued or taken into account. However, we did in general see quite a good alignment in terms of the decisions that patients find difficult when they're going into the decision-making process, and these have kind of informed useful targets for decision-making support tools.
Nice, awesome, thank you. Caitlin, you're up next, so unmute yourself. Are you planning to explore people's experiences with stigma further as we move forward and into the future?
Thanks, Ben. So I had planned on doing some additional interviews with parents from migrant backgrounds, but that was kind of halted with COVID and the lockdown. But we are looking at doing a qualitative systematic review to explore people's experiences with stigma. So that will be next on the cards.
Awesome, thank you. And then finally, unfortunately, Andre's not here. So Gabe, this last one's for you. Are we actually seeing any similar trends with other drugs? And do you think the themes would be similar? So if we are seeing a reduction in other drug use amongst young people?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we are seeing a lot of similar trends in a lot of other drugs. So yeah, we're seeing a decline in alcohol, but that goes along with a lot of other illicit substances. And yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a lot to be said about the link between declines in alcohol and declines in other drugs. And I think a lot of kind of what I've talked about and what I pointed to was these kind of social and economic factors that sort of limit how much time young people have to engage in sort of these kind of hedonistic or risk-based activities like drinking and like other drug use. So I do think there is a clear link there. Yeah.
Awesome. I also now have a follow-up. It's good to see people using the Q&A now. So question for Gabe again. Have you identified any differences in key themes between young males, females, or non-binary participants?
Yeah, I mean, the most noticeable aspect, I think, was perceptions of health. I think there are still very clearly gendered perceptions of health in terms of, you know, obviously drinking has a lot of links with how males perform masculinity. And that I think there is an aspect of that that is still there, but I think that's breaking down a little bit. So there are other ways for males to perform masculinity without having to drink or drink to excess. There's also other ways for them to perform health. Whereas I think for women, there's still a lot of traditions, and there's a lot of perceptions that female drinking is perhaps less acceptable, and particularly females getting drunk, and particularly in public spaces where health and safety might be a key concern. So I think there are still these kind of ongoing sort of binaries between male and female. We didn't actually have any participants that identified as non-binary, but definitely between male and female, there was quite a difference.
Awesome. Thanks, Gabe. Oh, do we have another question? Hang on a second. Nope, just the one. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll now move on to the next set of videos. Thank you, everyone who participated in that section. Everyone, remember the Q&A function is there. If you do have questions that still linger for that first group, please keep sending them, and I'll hand it over to Cass, who's going to play the next set. Cheers.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rosemary Miller from the Network of Alcohol and Other Drug Agencies. Today, I'll be presenting on, bring up my slide, nicotine dependence in clients receiving treatment for alcohol and other drug use. I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of staff from our member services who collected the data presented today. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation upon whose land the NADA office is situated. Some background. Last year, it was estimated that just over 10% of people, Australians aged 14 years or over, smoked on a daily basis. However, worldwide, an estimated 84% of people receiving drug and alcohol treatment smoked on a regular basis. In the NADA base, which is the data management system used by NADA members services, there are several measures that are classed as the client outcomes measurement system. And today we'll be focusing on nicotine dependence, or the questionnaire that indexes nicotine dependence. So we were interested in whether nicotine dependence at treatment intake could be used to assess those who would benefit the most from quitting interventions for smoking. So most of our sample that we looked at were male, and all data was collected between April 2017 and October of this year. And we indexed nicotine dependence with a modified Folkstrom test for nicotine dependence. Okay, so we've got some brief demographics on the slide, and we focus our analyses on people who reported a principal drug of concern of amphetamine type stimulants, alcohol, or cannabis type substances. Now, what we found was a main effect of principal drug of concern. And what this meant was that those who reported principal drug of concern of alcohol tended to report the highest levels of nicotine dependence. We also found some interesting results about the number of cigarettes smoked on a day-to-day basis in the 28 days prior to treatment intake. Of most note, there was a significant effect of principal drug of concern for the cigarette use, and it seems as though those with a principal drug of concern of alcohol tended to smoke more cigarettes on a day-to-day basis in the time period. So this could indicate that clients who report a principal drug of concern of alcohol may benefit the most from interventions for quitting smoking during their treatment. And there seem to be some very clear benefits to quitting smoking during treatment, as indicated by the references on the slide. Some of our future plans include looking at the data for other principal drugs of concern, polysubstance use, and also any follow-up data. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
I'm Lee Cooney. I'm a PhD candidate at NDOC, and our research is on the relationship between crypto market use, social networks, and adverse drug events. The project was funded by an NHMRC project grant and an NDOC PhD scholarship. So crypto markets are eBay-style online anonymous drug marketplaces, also called the darknet or deep web, and they're increasing in use around the world. This chart is from 2014 until 2019, showing an increased trend in English-speaking countries. One of the ways crypto markets are theorized to reduce harm is by having a feedback system to keep sellers accountable. If a negative experience is held by a customer, they can leave it to review and inform other consumers. But crypto markets could increase harm by facilitating solitary drug use. If people are buying alone, they could be using drugs alone, also being at a higher risk of adverse drug events. To look at this, we used the Global Drug Survey 2018, collected information on crypto market use, social networks, and adverse drug events. And also, if there was an adverse drug event and help wasn't sought, reasons as to why it wasn't sought. People who use crypto markets were more likely to report an adverse drug event for cocaine and LSD, and also more likely to be alone using MDMA, cocaine, and LSD compared to people who did not use crypto markets. When it comes to reasons for not seeking emergency help, being alone was more common for people who use crypto markets for MDMA and LSD, but also for LSD, friends advising them not to call for help. So the results suggest possible increased risk of adverse drug events for people who use crypto markets. However, it's only looking at an association between using drugs alone and adverse drug events, not necessarily the environment around the adverse drug event itself. If there is an increased risk, it would challenge the assumption of crypto markets reducing harm. There could be other variables at play as well, such as age. People who use crypto markets are younger, but so are people who report adverse drug events. Also, when people are advising others not to seek help, their friends, that type of possible harmful influence needs to be taken into account in social network analysis in order to get a more complete picture of the relationship between crypto market use, social networks, and adverse drug events. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ashley Stewart and I'm presenting on engagement with primary mental health care following prison release among men with dual diagnosis. Disclosures for this study are outlined here. People in prison experience disproportionate rates of mental illness. Approximately 50% of people in prison report a mental illness diagnosis and 27% are prescribed medication for a mental illness. The prison release period is a time of heightened stress and poor health and social outcomes, often characterised by an acute rise in risk of death, psychological distress, and resumption of substance use. People are also seeking housing and employment and reconnecting with family and social networks. Therefore, understanding the mental health trajectories of people leaving prison is of importance, particularly those with dual diagnosis. In the community, the role of primary healthcare in mental health is well recognised, with GPs providing mental health care to approximately 75% of those seeking help. GPs have an essential role in the continuing care of people who have a mental illness, particularly during periods of heightened stress, such as reintegrating from prison to the community. So given that, the aim of this study is to describe primary mental health care presentations within 3 months of any prison release between March 2014 and October 2016 from the Prison and Transition Health Cohort Study. The PASS study is a prospective cohort study of men leaving prison who report histories of recent regular injecting drug use. The study involved baseline and up to 3 follow-up interviews along with extensive record linkage. For this study, primary healthcare data come from the Medicare Benefit Schedule, mental health diagnoses come from the Victorian Statewide Public Mental Health Database, and imprisonment episodes from Corrections Victoria. Of the 400 PATH participants, 335 were included in this study. The mean age was 36 years, most were born in Australia, almost half completed less than 10 years of education, and 3/4 reported 3 or more episodes of adult incarceration. In the 3 months following any prison release, there were 4,009 primary care episodes, 73% were professional attendances, 13% were specified mental health treatment presentations and were provided to 157 participants. Figure 1 displays the distribution of all primary care presentations per person with a median of 6, while Figure 2 displays the distribution of all mental health primary care presentations per person with a median of 2. 53% of participants included in this study had a previous mental illness diagnosis and accounted for 58% of all primary care episodes. Of all mental health treatment episodes, just over half were provided to people with a previous mental illness. Despite the significant mental health morbidity among this sample, there was limited access to targeted high-level primary mental health care following prison release, regardless of past mental illness diagnosis. Finally, research is required to understand the barriers to accessing primary mental health care among this group, while future work is planned in exploring the incidence of primary care compared to tertiary care presentations for mental health. My acknowledgements are available here. My references. Thank you.
My name is Jack Wilson and I'm from the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use at the University of Sydney. I'll be speaking about a systematic review that forms part of my PhD. The understanding that cannabis is a gateway drug to more harmful substances was initially investigated by Denise Kendall in 1975. Among a group of US high school students, cannabis was found to be a crucial step between legal substances like alcohol and harder drugs such as opioids. Since Kendall's findings, research has continued to demonstrate that cannabis use often precedes and may increase the likelihood of using more harmful substances. Although Kendall cautioned that her findings should not be considered causal, the idea of cannabis as a gateway drug contributed to educational programs and restrictive cannabis policies. Despite the abundance of research demonstrating that cannabis typically precedes opioid use, some evidence suggests that this pattern of substance use is not fixed. A greater understanding of this transition between cannabis and opioid use will inform prevention and intervention programs, ultimately reducing the health burden associated with opioids, the most harmful illicit drug worldwide. Given the risks involved in this transition, the current review aimed to examine the likelihood of transitioning from first-time cannabis use to opioid use and opioid use disorders, abuse, or dependence. Furthermore, we look to assess whether the likelihood of transitioning varies according to cannabis use characteristics. As you can see, 6 studies were deemed eligible. Data collection spanned between 1977 and 2017, within Australia, New Zealand, and the US. They were made up of longitudinal, cross-sectional, and twin studies. After pulling the effect sizes together, an odds ratio of 2.76 indicated a greater likelihood of using opioids following cannabis use compared to non-cannabis users. Similar results suggest a greater likelihood of developing harmful patterns of opioid use given prior cannabis use. Some of the highlighted notable findings within studies suggest that moderate to severe pain and early age cannabis use appear to be risk factors in transitioning from cannabis to opioid use. Also, those with past 12-month cannabis use disorder may be more likely to later develop harmful patterns of opioid use. In conclusion, a synthesis of the evidence found that cannabis users are at particular risk of harmful opioid use, which may be exacerbated by pain, early age cannabis use, and history of a cannabis use disorder. Further research will improve our understanding of specific risk factors involved in the transition, ultimately assisting in the prevention of harmful opioid use.
Awesome, thank you everyone. So we do have some questions that have come through, both via the chat and through the Q&A function, which is still open if you want to fire some questions in there. So first up, Rosemary, do you want to unmute yourself and turn your camera on? So one question for you, can you talk more about the parameters you use to select participants from the database?
Sure can. Just for some context, if you're not familiar with database, it's a living database. So we do have services are using it actively to update details about their clients. So obviously when you look at that kind of data, you just need to be a bit careful about how you interpret it. So the main 2 parameters that I used were the results were confined to people who were receiving treatment for their own drug use. And also I confined the data to people aged between 12 and 75 years old.
Cool, awesome, thank you. So my next question, and we have a couple for you, go out to Lee. So Lee, first question comes from the floor. Is there any data available on whether any crypto market customers test their products? So using home drug testing kits, for example, before they use it.
That's a really good question. And the Global Drug Survey has thousands of variables, so that information will be there. I just don't have the numbers in front of me. But what people who not just use crypto markets, but also use drugs generally is submit samples to Energy Control in Spain, and they get the results back there. And that'll actually be the next study where it's comparing the quality of drugs from the darknet compared to non-darknet sources. But also the sellers on the darknet, they also submit those results to advertise to attest to the quality of their products as well. Yeah.
Awesome. You have another couple that are coming through. So also, can you talk about how the pandemic may have impacted darknet use?
Sure. So it kind of facilitates contactless trade. So, you know, that happens with shopping now, and with the darknet, it comes in the post. So people who want to do that sort of thing, that would be increased possibly. But also in terms of this study where people may be using drugs alone, because in some circumstances you're not allowed to see people, that would be a greater risk as well. So there's a lot of different factors in terms of drug procurement, drug use being alone, and even on the supply side, there might even be a lower side on the supply side as well.
Awesome, thanks. So another one for you before you mute yourself. This one's come from the floor as well. Have you considered purity and strength of the drugs on crypto markets as a risk factor for adverse drug events?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so for the next study where we're looking at adulteration, the level of adulteration from darknet sources compared to non-darknet sources, it's very interesting to see all the different adulterants, because there are adulterants where there's basically no data on it because they're just new, people are creating new substances all the time. So there would be associations between toxic adulteration and increased adverse drug events, but also, as you say, with high purity as well. Purity doesn't necessarily equate to less harm. If people are used to less purity and then they suddenly have a higher strength substance, that could be harmful as well. So there's a lot of different factors there. Depends on what's going on. That's a good question.
And then finally, why do you think you see such the geographical differences? More importantly, why is New Zealand so low?
In terms of darknet use?
Yeah.
I don't know, because Australia uses it a lot. That's a good question. I don't know what if there's any drug policy differences in New Zealand and Australia. Probably not.
They're pretty similar, but
pretty similar.
Yeah, it just stood out to me that New Zealand was so low compared to.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I don't know that much about New Zealand in terms of that side of things. I know it's very beautiful and that sort of thing, but that doesn't really explain it. So that's a good question though.
Yeah, cool, thanks. Thank you so much, Lee. So I will now jump on to Ashley. There are a couple of questions coming up to you. So you're currently muted, so if you unmute yourself as well. Is there any evidence for what kinds of support post-incarceration are most helpful?
Yep, absolutely. So thanks for that question, James. I think it came through from him. So I've just put in the chat as well, but I will speak to it while we're on here. So there is some targeted linkage to healthcare post-release that's been shown to be useful in some instances. But to be honest, most people when they leave prison are sort of left to navigate the system on their own. So there really is, it really is warranted for some more research in this space. So I don't have, unfortunately, some great types of support that I can voice at this point, but hopefully as research happens, there will be more things that pop up.
Cool, and another one from Chris has just come through as well. Does MBS provide information on why people were presenting to their GPs and whether they were given referrals to other health professionals or services?
Yep, so thank you, great question. The MBS data is actually quite limited, so I'm not sure if many people who have attended today have used MBS data before. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of information around why people are presenting to the GPs. So this is a particular problem with the way that we are using the data, and really need to make sure that we are quite cautious about the way that we use it. So for a lot of consultations, they will be recorded as something like a level A consultation, a level B consultation, or a level C consultation. And that is mostly just in relation to how long they spend with the GP. So you can't really tell what's happened in that time frame. So of course, somebody might have presented to the GP and they might have had a prescription for mental health, or they might have had a quick chat about mental health. And so the more high level presentations relating to mental health are the ones that we're focusing on, which are recorded as a mental health treatment plan initiation, or a mental health treatment plan review, or some very specific sort of psych services like a psychologist appointment or a psychiatrist appointment. So they're the ones that we're sort of focusing on, and there will be a bit of a plan for us to try and map those to see if those who are getting initiated a treatment plan, those treatment plans are being reviewed, and whether or not people are actually then following up with those sort of, I think it's 10 consultations that they get with psychologists or psychiatrists. So these are some of the limitations. We also don't get information on referrals, unfortunately. So these are some of the things that we need to be cautious with. Thanks.
And can you speak to any of the other limitations with using MBS data?
I mean, they're kind of the main ones, to be honest, just that there is a real lack of information that you get out of some of those, the way that they're coded with those level A, level B, level C consultations. And so I think, you know, the last thing that we would want to do is to say that, you know, GPs aren't doing anything for people's mental health treatment, which is probably quite untrue. So we're trying to just remain very specific to that really high level of care that is being captured in the data.
Awesome, cool, thank you. Everyone, do keep spamming the Q&A function if you have any more questions that come through. Jack, if you want to unmute yourself and turn on your video, I do have a couple of questions for you.
Yep.
So we're seeing a big move in some countries, and even recently in the US election, about the move to sort of legalize cannabis. What role do you think that might have?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I guess it's a very broad question, but in relation to my talk, I think that it can be sort of quite concerning, considering that there is more than twice as likely chance of using harmful opioid use and developing harmful patterns of opioid use given prior cannabis use. And so I think sort of in the context of that, it can be quite concerning. But I think regardless of the mechanisms that are behind that association, I think there is a great opportunity for us to develop those targeted interventions for those who are at the greatest risk, those cannabis users who are at the greatest risk of using harmful opioids. And when they are at that greatest risk as well. Some research from Catherine Keyes last year, I believe, also found that cannabis is starting to be used earlier in the sequence, so before alcohol and cigarettes in this gateway sequence. And I think if there are causal mechanisms behind that relationship between cannabis and opioid use, it can be quite concerning. But I guess future research, research has investigated whether those relationships are causal or due to underlying factors. But I guess that's outside the bounds of my review.
I guess, again, taking you sort of outside the bounds. So some of the propositions that have gone through is to both legalize, but then tax and pull that money into treatment to maybe target those groups who say might be at most risk. Do you think they would sort of offset each other, or again, I'm asking you to speculate, and I'm sorry.
Yeah. So to use some of that money that may be used from taxing cannabis or THC units and putting them into treatment, is that sort of, yeah. I guess that's something that could be. We know that the lower cannabis risk guidelines have suggested that with THC units should be taxed, and to sort of reduce use of highly potent cannabis products, because we know that highly potent cannabis products are associated with greater risk of health outcomes such as cannabis use disorder and psychosis. So that is a great idea in that sense, and I think. And that's not something that has been explored within America and Canada of putting that tax money into treatment, but I think it's something that we should consider. Yeah.
Awesome. And you've got another one that's just come from the floor as well. So would you say the findings from your systematic review support the gateway theory?
Oh, it's a horrible phrase, isn't it? I just don't like it at all. I guess it sort of, I think that sort of, that phrase, the gateway theory, really suggests that there are causal mechanisms between cannabis and opioid use. And although in the last 20 years, non-human studies have shown more evidence for causal mechanisms, I think that a lot of what sort of has been put into the gateway theory is a lot of fear mongering and misinformation. So I think it's important that we sort of we talk about how, you know, those with cannabis, those using cannabis are at greater risk, but also talk about the possible mechanisms behind that and explore that further. So yeah, I mean, it is apparent that, you know, it is quite clear, and I'm sure I'm sure it has been quite clear in the literature that those using cannabis are at greater risk, and opioid use rarely ever occurs without prior cannabis use.
Awesome, thanks, Jack. I think there was one more question for Ash, but it appears to have disappeared on my screen. So Ashley might be addressing that one now in the chat. So sorry about, question for Ash, here we go. What about PBS data and looking at whether GPs are prescribing that could be related to MH treatment or mental health treatment? Would that give you more information?
Yeah, so thanks so much, Penny. I did just respond in the chat as well, but I can voice it here as well. So we have got access to PBS data and we have considered using it in this way, but really conscious that sometimes mental health medications can be prescribed for reasons other than for mental health, so for sleeping and things like that. And so we would not want to sort of just, I guess, make inference on medication being prescribed in a certain consultation and then that being referred to mental health. So some caution also to be taken there, but definitely something to consider. So thanks for raising that.
Right, awesome. Okay, that is all of our questions. Thank you everyone so much who put together those videos and who showed up live to answer questions. We're now going to turn this over to Robin Room, who is going to present APSAD's paper award. Just while Robin's getting ready and unmuting his mic and his camera, please keep sending questions through to the presenters if you have them, and they can answer them in that live chat. And once Robin's presented the paper, we will then open up a poll so you can vote on who your best, your favorite presenter was. So I'll pass it over to you, Robin, now.
Okay, thank you. It's been a great pleasure to listen to all of these presentations. Now I want to honor Monica Barratt with an award, which is the Early and Mid-Career Drug and Alcohol Review Paper Award for the year. Monica has published in Drug and Alcohol Review for pretty close to 10 years, I think, looking at it. Maybe it's a bit longer than that. But this is particularly for the paper on pill testing or drug checking in Australia, the acceptability of service design features that was published in 2018. There was another paper she was the first author on also in 2018. And she's also now on our very much valued member of our editorial board, but this is an award for the research that she's carried out, and for the many, behind that research stand a number of different functions that she's had as a drugs policy researcher in several institutions, and publishing over 80 academic research papers, being a mainstay of the Global Drug Survey, which we heard about a little bit before, and also of other research units. So congratulations, Monica.
Thanks so much, Robin. Really appreciate the award from APSAD. It's really lovely to receive. And I'd also like to thank my co-authors on the 2018 paper, Alison Ritter, Bruno Raimondo, and Nadine Ezard. And all of them had a fantastic role to play in that paper. But in particular, I just want to acknowledge Alison, because I had my NHMRC fellowship for 5 years under her mentorship. And at the start of that fellowship, I said, well, my fellowship wasn't actually going to be about drug checking or pill testing, although that's somewhat related to the topic, but should I just go ahead? She's like, pursue your passion. So thanks for that advice, Alison. And I would say that to all of you out there, do pursue your passion, do what you want to do as best you can within the resources you have. And that paper was an example. It's one of my most highly cited papers. It's having an effect on policy and practice. And it was not born of a grant. It was born of a passion. So, you know, don't not pursue those ideas when you have them is what I would say. And yeah, thanks so much. Really a pleasure to receive this award.
Kia ora, Monica, and congratulations. I think we are now going to open up the poll so that everyone can vote on who their favorite presentation was. While that's going up, I should also again remind you that we could not fit everything into this session, and there are a heap more presentations and posters that are held live now on the APSAD website. And I think Cass is just posting that through now. So please go check those out. There's much more research from ECRs that really represent how awesome Australian ECR research is. So I'm hoping now all of you can see a poll in front of you. Those are all of our presenters. If you could select who your favorite was. I know that's very, very difficult to do. And again, thank you to all our presenters, but select who your favorite was and submit that. And at the end of the next session, Cass is going to announce that. So while this poll is up, I also note we're going to take a very brief intermission. So go get yourself a coffee or some kai and come back, and we're going to start the next session very, very soon. Cass, do you have anything else to add?
No, just I hope you all enjoyed that, and thanks to all our speakers and to Robin and Monica.